The U.S. presidency makes the occupant of that office the most powerful person on the planet.
I could be a stupid person and say, oh, no, we don't want a free plane.
If you are someone whose deficiencies cry out for more submission to you and more adulation of you,
I would never be one to turn down that kind of an offer. I mean, I could be a stupid person and say, no, we don't want a free, very expensive airplane.
how hard it's got to be to have so much power and yet be denied those few extra steps that would deliver you right to dictatorship.
Let me tell you, you should be embarrassed asking that question. They're giving us a free jet. I could say, no, 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 don't give us, I want to pay you $1 billion or 400 million or whatever it is. Or I could say, thank you very much.
I think probably we would all be a little bit vulnerable to losing perspective in that situation. But I also like to imagine that it wouldn't be that hard to bring most people back to reality.
You've been embarrassed enough, and so has your network. Your network is a disaster. ABC is a disaster. Here is the bill. Bobby, come on over here.
However, the current holder of the presidency is not someone who can be brought back to reality, having lived somewhere outside it for many years now, perhaps even decades.
Look, you got me.
So it is that we have these current fights in which the president is laying waste to vast areas of our democracy because he can act in ways that are tremendously harmful.
As we speak, our president, Donald Trump, is going to the Middle East on a public corruption tour.
Yet he is raging in part because he isn't allowed to act in ways that would be even more destructive.
His first trip is to these three countries because these are the three countries that have agreed to pay Donald Trump money. Donald Trump is going to collect tribute, and it's all just out in the open.
We'll set aside the inane game of sporadic and fluctuating tariffs that Trump has been playing, which are currently destabilizing the global economy.
But that's not all he's getting from Qatar. The Trump Organization recently signed a $5.5 billion golf course and real estate deal with Dar Global and Qatari Dar, a firm established by Qatar's sovereign wealth fund. $5.5 billion. While Trump's in office, it would have been unthinkable for any previous president to enter into a $5.5 billion business deal with anybody, never mind a foreign government, while they are in office, and it still should be unthinkable.
Today, I'm more interested in what's happening domestically, and I want to look at comments made by White House advisor Stephen Miller last Friday about habeas corpus, the right of individuals to appeal detention by the U.S. government and demonstrate that what's happening to them is unlawful.
President Trump has talked about potentially suspending habeas corpus to take care of the illegal immigration problem. When could we see that happen, do you think?
Well, the Constitution is clear.
Miller said to journalists on the White House driveway Friday. And that, of course, again, still his words, is the supreme law of the land.
That the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus
can be suspended at a time of invasion.
So I would say that's an option we're actively looking at. Look, a lot of it depends on whether the courts do the right thing or not.
I want to talk today about this idea of suspending habeas corpus, why it upsets so many people, and the history of how it's been used at some key moments in the last century. And I want to expand all that to talk a little more about states of emergency and how governments claiming to be saving a country have used these kinds of declarations to subjugate whole nations.
You got me.
So why is Stephen Miller talking about habeas corpus?
Because kings love suspending the writ of habeas corpus. That's why those founders put this in the Constitution.
On one level, it's because the courts aren't backing up the administration, which wants to call fluctuations in immigrants crossing the southern border an invasion. They want to do this in order to be able to take a warlike footing against immigrants and to be able to treat them any way they wish, to disappear them, to consign them to indefinite detention abroad, to treat them as if they were convicted criminals, even if they're guilty of nothing but being in the country without permission.
Habeas corpus is a Latin term that means produce the body. It's your right to challenge your detention if you believe you're being held unlawfully. It forces the government to explain why it's holding you and prove that it has a legal reason to do so.
Typically, the power is given to the president by Congress, which had made no moves in that direction recently. In the meantime, the administration as a whole appears to be furious that the courts won't back them up on saying there's an invasion and won't let them get out of observing due process of following the law.
Number one, the writ of habeas corpus can only be suspended when there is a rebellion or invasion and, quote, the public safety may require it. So it is not enough even that there is an invasion or a rebellion. It is an invasion and a rebellion that is so dangerous to public safety that it requires the suspension of habeas corpus.
President Trump said just last week, it's a very difficult thing with the courts.
Because the courts have all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they said, maybe you have to have trials. We're going to have 5 million trials. Doesn't work. You wouldn't have a country left.
I'd like to suggest that another reason the executive branch wants to suspend habeas corpus, which is to be able to detain its opponents indefinitely without having to justify its actions.
Stephen Miller is the architect of Donald Trump's authoritarian dream. And anyone who thinks it begins and ends with violent migrants has not been paying attention the last 100 days. And anyone who thinks it will not end with the U.S. citizens and Donald Trump's decrees against his political enemies, frankly, has not paid attention to history.
But I don't even have to be right about the president's intentions with regard to habeas corpus for it to be a threat. All you have to do is ask yourself whether, if Trump were given this power with regard to immigrants, but would suddenly also find himself legally able to arrest anyone he wanted, including the journalists he's repeatedly called enemies of the people, would he stop at the detention and arrest of just immigrants?
You should be embarrassed asking that question.
I think not. There are some additional recent actions that also concern me. The government last week declared a military zone around El Paso.
It's now officially part of Fort Bliss.
It's the second such zone created along the southern border.
Last month, the Army took over a 170-mile strip of New Mexico borderland, now run by Fort Huachuca.
Inside such a zone, the longstanding restriction on military involvement in civilian law enforcement activities are lifted.
Migrants who cross into these military zones can face charges for both illegal entry and trespassing on federal military property. In New Mexico, more than 24 migrants were recently charged after being spotted by a military aircraft. Troops didn't make those arrests, but they are authorized to detain individuals, provide medical aid, and then hand them over to civilian authorities.
This action was taken despite an 87% drop in migrant encounters in this region between August 2024 and March 2025.
We may question the morality of it. We may question the humanitarian aspects of it. We may even say that it's a very cruel strategy and that it locks people in place, that it forces people to stay under very difficult conditions. But at the end of the day, I think Mexico and the U.S. have worked in lockstep and sealed the border.
Even more alarming in recent days was the arrest of Newark Mayor Ras Baraka.
They made a decision to arrest me.
The mayor was arrested outside an ICE facility that he said is operating illegally and which he is trying to get shut down.
Baraka says he was held in custody for 5 hours. He says his mugshot was taken. He was fingerprinted as well. Despite all of that, when I talked to him earlier today, he was adamant that he did not do anything wrong.
He's been released since, but the government is claiming that he was trespassing.
The onus is on them. It's not on me. They made a decision to arrest me. They made a decision to violate me. They made a decision to humiliate me, to put me in cuffs.
U.S. representatives who accompanied him were accused of body slamming a female ICE officer. I'm not an attorney, but looking at videos of the incident, it's hard to see how the government's account holds water. Bonnie Watson Coleman, one of the congressmen present in the scrum, is 80 years old. So I want to look at a couple other incidents in which the government used a spurious threat to institute or expand mass detentions and kept that power of arbitrary confinement for more than a decade. The Reichstag fire is the gorilla in the room when it comes to examples of suspending habeas corpus. This fire took place at Germany's equivalent to Capitol Hill just weeks after Hitler was appointed chancellor in 1933.
Everybody was running and panting towards the Reichstag, and 3 black Mercedes cars drew up. And I said, I bet that's Hitler. And he said, I do hope to God that this, as I believe, is the work of the communists.
We still don't know the exact cause of the fire, but there is no question that the incident was used to pressure Paul von Hindenburg, then the president, to sharply curtail civil rights and give the government powers of detention, ostensibly to protect the country from what was widely portrayed as a communist revolutionary menace. The cabinet seized emergency powers through cabinet vote, then arrested representatives.
Hitler and his cabinet wasted no time drawing up a more permanent and expansive doctrine known as the Reichstag Fire Decree, which outlawed the right of assembly, freedom of the press, and freedom of speech. At the same time, removing restraints on police investigations, which led to the arrest, torture, and imprisonment of some 4,000 people.
This is a key reason why arresting mayors and congresspeople is a very dangerous thing to do. And they did this before a Reichstag vote on the Enabling Act.
While preserving the semblance of legality, the act essentially transfers state power to Hitler. His critics are intimidated.
Sie sind wehleidig, meine Herren, wenn Sie jetzt schon von Verfolgung sprechen.
On March 23rd, the majority of delegates vote for their own disempowerment.
These arrests of political opponents in the months after coming to power provided the first Nazi concentration camp detainees, the people who were corralled in camps until more purpose-built facilities came into being. Now, there were real communist parties in Germany at the time with elected representatives who were part of a functional government. And it's also true that some violent leftist extremists existed who were dedicated to overthrowing the Weimar Republic itself. But the Reichstag Fire Decree, followed by the Enabling Act, both of which ended up establishing dictatorship in Germany, they were shoved through under distress. They shattered Germany. They assured its destruction and the death of millions at home and abroad, destroying the republic more completely than any communist movement ever could have. Chile in 1973 is likewise a cautionary tale for the U.S. today. When the generals who led a military coup on September 11th of that year were confronted with the challenge of justifying their arrests and executions, what emerged was known as Plan Zeta, a concocted story about a shadowy plan by the left which had fairly won the presidency, but supposedly wanted to stay in power indefinitely. A 264-page white paper all about Plan Zeta was published weeks after the military coup, accusing leftists of plotting to transform Chile into a dictatorship. Those who supported the coup lapped up every invented detail, and the New York Times even reported Chileans bragging that they had been on the list of those targeted for assassination and had therefore been saved by the generals who intervened to prevent a dictatorship by establishing their own dictatorship.
Can you predict when the power will be returned to the people of Chile?
¿Se puede prevenir cuándo el gobierno va a ser devuelto al pueblo de Chile?
Es una pregunta que la hacen todos, señorita.
That's a question that everybody does.
Pero yo a todos les manifiesto que nosotros no podemos fijar plazos ni tiempo, sino objetivos.
All they get the same answer. We cannot fix a date or timetable, but aims to reach objectives.
And Chile remained in that dictatorship for 17 years. The military junta first took power in 1973, and Augusto Pinochet did not relinquish military control until 1998, 8 years after the ostensible return to democracy.
Pinochet remained as commander-in-chief of the army and was made a senator for life. But in 1998, he was indicted in Spain for his crimes committed in office, and he would be arrested in London where he was receiving medical treatment only a few days later, in a stunning legal event that captured headlines the world over.
So these are long-term crises that get triggered in these kinds of situations. As usual, the U.S. has its own rich history in this area. Habeas corpus has been formally suspended several times in U.S. history.
The writ of habeas corpus is called the Great Writ because it's the ultimate freedom that we have to go to court and to ask the judge to look into why we're being incarcerated. The term means, bring me the body.
During World War II in Hawaii, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, suspension was used to detain Japanese Americans on the islands.
Because of press censorship, many people in Hawaii did not know that more than 400 individuals were arrested immediately after December the 7th and held indefinitely without charges. Through the course of the war, this number grew to 1,500. Most were of Japanese ancestry.
Before that, it was implemented in response to a 1905 uprising in the Philippines, a newly acquired territory at that point administered by America. And the U.S. had imposed its own concentration camps there not long before that.
Disappointed to say that investigations of 9 counties of South Carolina that embraced the position of denying the emancipated citizens of those counties the benefits of freedom.
Prior to that, suspension was allowed in 9 South Carolina counties in 1871 to combat the influence of the Ku Klux Klan.
I suspended the writ of habeas corpus in these 9 counties. I ordered the military forces in these locations to move immediately and arrest any of these individuals denying other individuals the rights of freedom.
Most famously, habeas corpus was suspended once without first getting the approval of Congress during the Civil War by Abraham Lincoln.
Chief Justice Roger B. Taney's opinion in Ex parte Merryman, 1861, rebuked the president for unconstitutionally suspending the writ of habeas corpus. Taney held that the president did not have authority to suspend the writ of habeas corpus without the consent of Congress. The habeas corpus clause, said Taney, appeared within Article 1 of the Constitution, pertaining to the powers and duties of Congress. However, Congress later enacted a law ratifying the president's decisions to suspend the writ of habeas corpus.
And though Congress did give its assent to all but one of those suspensions up front, even this small handful of instances when habeas corpus has been suspended, they've had significant issues, and they continue to be debated as legal and ethical conundrums. That they remain so controversial is a good reminder that standards ought to be extremely high anytime a suspension is discussed or allowed. Another key frame in U.S. history to use when considering habeas corpus is war on terror detentions at Guantanamo. Now, I've talked a lot in various episodes about Gitmo because it's really central to issues of detention from across the last decades in America. And indeed, there's a critical body of habeas corpus cases from Guantanamo. In 2008, Boumediene versus Bush, the Supreme Court established that detainees at Guantanamo, even though they were suspected terrorists and not American citizens, had the right to habeas corpus and that U.S. courts had jurisdiction. In 2021, just 4 years ago, Asadullah Harun Gul won his habeas corpus petition. More than a decade after that key 2008 court case, he was finally transferred back to Afghanistan. Any recourse would be much harder to come by now for immigrants than for the people at Gitmo. Prior to 2025, the U.S. had different services, including an Office of Immigration Detention Ombudsman. But Trump's likely illegal actions in decimating the federal government have essentially removed that avenue and all those approaches for immigrants to have to contest their detention. And thinking back to Stephen Miller's words on Friday,
the Constitution is clear, and that, of course, is the supreme law of the land, that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended in a time of invasion.
Privilege was a word he used to refer to habeas corpus. And I saw a lot of people taking offense at that. And in fact, I did myself at first. But though he made it sound like some kind of indulgence given by the president, the word is actually in the text of Article 1 of the Constitution. The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. But I do think that Miller's tone really misrepresents it. Habeas corpus is not a privilege that you have to do something to earn from the president or from his minions. It's a vital right granted by the Constitution to citizens, one that can only be suspended in dire conditions that threaten the existence of the country. And even then, only when public safety requires it. Over the centuries, that right has been expanded on by courts to cover any U.S. resident here, with papers or without. It's a core piece of what it means to live in America. And one thing that's critical here is that Miller's words suggest that suspension might be the next move, but it, quote, depends on whether the courts do the right thing or not. After Miller's statement, U.S. Senator John Barrasso of Wyoming,
would you vote to suspend habeas corpus since the power does ultimately lie with Congress?
The president has said he will follow the law.
Would not give a yes or no answer to a reporter's question, refusing to rule out supporting the suspension of habeas corpus if the issue were to come before Congress.
Just to put a fine point on this, I want to know what you would do. Would you vote to suspend habeas corpus if this were brought before Congress? Ultimately, this power lies with Congress.
The president said he is going to follow the law.
I would like to imagine that any effort to get Congress to throw habeas corpus out the window would not be indulged. But I don't think we can count on anything from the Republican House and the Republican Senate. So it's critical to keep pressure on your elected representatives on the issue of habeas corpus, but also on accountability in general, on the important issues today of Medicaid cuts to health care for poor and disabled Americans, on tax breaks for the ultra-rich.
You cannot deny the top 0.2% will get $235 billion in tax breaks while we cut Medicaid. Okay.
Keep calling and writing them and letting them know that their constituents are not only paying attention, but have very strong feelings about this. Our elected representatives need to feel that their political future is jeopardized more by undoing the rights of Americans than by crossing a president who wants unlimited power.
Hello. Hello. I'm talking to you because I work for you.
And you can take action too, often right near you. It doesn't just have to involve a Tesla takedown, although that's still a great thing to do. But in other options, this week, for instance, faith ministers used their bodies to block the entrance of the same ICE facility in New Jersey where the arrests took place last week. They were taking a stand against current U.S. immigration policy and government overreach. The long fingers of the Trump administration are working their way into every part of our lives. It's up to us to say enough. And that's it.
Thanks for listening to Next Comes What. Please share this with anyone who's looking for ways to help each other survive this mess. To support this podcast, please subscribe at AndreaPitzer.com and consider giving Next Comes What a 5-star review where you get your podcasts.
Thank you to all the faithful weekly listeners that are out there. And if you are somebody that checks in each week, I just wanted to give you a heads up that after 7 months of operation, I am going to be taking 2 weeks away. I will be crewing an Arctic vessel that is headed from the Netherlands up to northern Norway. And it's not yet clear, because I haven't ever sailed that route before, how much connectivity we'll have. If I can, I will send Jason some video clips, and maybe he can do a little mini update from the melting Arctic, and we can talk about climate issues very briefly. But I have been in the Arctic many times.
After I finished the camps book, there was also a part of me that said, concentration camps on 6 continents is enough. I want to go somewhere. There were no concentration camps. I want to go somewhere and do something quite different to sort of to a little bit recuperate from the ordeal of writing that book.
Where you do not have anything like video reception or even email reception that you can use in any useful way. So this might be a notice that if you stuck around through this whole episode to find out that there'll be a hiatus for a couple weeks, or who knows, maybe you'll get a surprise while I'm gone. But in either case, I'll be back the first week of June, and we'll have an episode of Next Comes What Then. Thanks for listening.